In 2026, your bank account will show the same number it shows today. You'll check your balance and feel reassured. You saved money. You were responsible. But here's what they won't tell you: that money is already dead. It just doesn't know it yet. The number in your account will buy half of what it bought 5 years ago. Your rent will be higher. Your groceries will cost more. Gas, insurance, utilities, all more expensive. But your savings, still the same number, just worth less, buying less, protecting you from nothing. And while you watch your purchasing power evaporate, a small group of people will get richer than you can imagine. Not because they worked harder, not because they're smarter, but because they designed a system where your loss is their profit, where inflation that destroys your savings rescues their balance sheets, where printing money saves governments and banks while quietly bankrupting everyone else. This isn't a prediction, this is a pattern. And it's been repeating for a century. Every time governments drown in debt, they use the same playbook: print money, keep interest rates below inflation, let prices silently wipe out savings, blame external forces, and when it's over, they've escaped their debts and you're poorer. The receipts are public, the pattern is documented, and 2026 is when it happens again. Let me show you exactly how they're going to do it. There's a business model in modern economics that's more reliable than any stock, more consistent than real estate, more protected than any monopoly. It's made governments solvent, banks profitable, and asset holders wealthy for generations. And it's built on one simple premise: destroy the value of money to escape debt. This isn't economic theory, this is recorded history. And the pattern repeats every single time a government borrows more than it can repay. Here's how it works: 5 steps, same sequence every time. Step 1, create too much debt. Governments spend beyond their means: wars, stimulus programs, bailouts, entitlements. The reasons vary, but the result is always the same: debt that can't be repaid with real economic growth. Step 2, print money to paper over the crisis. When debt becomes unsustainable, governments don't cut spending. They don't default, they print. They call it quantitative easing or monetary stimulus or emergency measures, but it's the same thing: creating new money that dilutes every dollar you already have. Step 3, hold interest rates below inflation. Central banks keep rates artificially low, lower than the rate prices are rising. This guarantees that anyone holding cash or bonds loses purchasing power every year. Savings accounts earning 2% while inflation runs at 7% means you're losing 5% annually, guaranteed. Step 4, let asset prices explode while wages lag. The new money doesn't go to you. It goes to banks, to corporations, to asset markets. Stock prices soar, real estate doubles, but your salary maybe up 3%. Maybe. So the people who own assets get richer. The people who work for wages fall behind. Step 5, blame someone else. When people notice prices rising, when they realize their money buys less, the narrative shifts. It's corporate greed. It's supply chains. It's Putin. It's global events. Anything except the truth: that policymakers chose inflation to avoid default. They chose to destroy your savings to save themselves. 5 steps, same pattern. And if you track it across the last century, you see it repeat. Weimar Germany, America in the 1970s, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Argentina, even the United States from 2008 through today. Different countries, different decades, same playbook. Because while savers get wiped out and workers fall behind, governments escape debt, banks stay solvent, and asset holders multiply their wealth. It's not a bug, it's the business model. And the receipts are public record. Let me show you how it's worked before, who profited, and why 2026 is when they do it again. Let's start with the clearest example: Weimar Germany, 1921 to 1923. The textbook case of how inflation destroys a middle class while the elites survive. After World War I, Germany owed massive reparations to the Allied powers: 132 billion gold marks. That's roughly $442 billion in today's money. The German economy was devastated. Production was down. Unemployment was high. There was no way to repay through taxation or economic growth. So what did the Weimar government do? They printed money. The Reichsbank ran the printing presses day and night. New marks flooded the economy, and prices exploded. In January 1922, a loaf of bread cost 163 marks. By September 1923, the same loaf cost 1.5 million marks. In November 1923, at the peak, bread cost 200 billion marks. Here's what that meant for ordinary Germans: anyone with savings in marks was wiped out. A middle-class family that had saved 100,000 marks, enough to buy a house in 1921, couldn't buy a loaf of bread with it in 1923. Life savings, pensions, bonds, all worthless. An entire generation of savers destroyed in 2 years. But here's the critical detail: not everyone lost. Industrial companies that owned factories, machinery, and real assets survived. They borrowed marks, bought equipment, and repaid the loans with worthless currency. Their debts evaporated, but their factories remained. The Krupp family, steel and arms manufacturers, thrived. They held tangible assets. When the mark collapsed, their wealth was in steel mills and weapons factories, not paper currency. Hugo Stinnes, an industrialist and speculator, became one of the richest men in Germany by buying up distressed assets with borrowed money, and then repaying those debts with worthless marks. And the Weimar government, their debt disappeared. The 132 billion gold marks in reparations became meaningless once they inflated the currency. They escaped their obligations by destroying their money. The pattern was clear. Debt holders and savers lost everything. Asset holders and borrowers won, and the government solved its debt problem by bankrupting its citizens. Now let's look at America, the 1970s, a decade when inflation quietly reduced government debt while wages stagnated and savers got destroyed. By 1970, America was drowning in obligations. The Vietnam War had cost hundreds of billions. Social Security and Medicare were expanding. The gold standard, which limited money printing, was abandoned in 1971, and President Nixon faced a choice: cut spending, raise taxes, or inflate. He chose inflation. The Federal Reserve under Arthur Burns kept interest rates low even as prices rose. From 1973 to 1982, inflation averaged over 8% annually. Some years hit 13%, but interest rates on savings accounts rarely exceeded 5%. Bonds paid 7% while inflation ran at 10%. What did this mean for ordinary Americans? Anyone holding cash lost purchasing power every year. A worker who saved $10,000 in 1970 found that by 1980, that same $10,000 could buy what $4,500 bought in 1970. More than half the value gone. Not spent, not lost to bad investments. Simply eroded by policy. Wages couldn't keep up. Average hourly earnings rose, but not as fast as prices. In real terms, purchasing power per hour work declined through the 1970s. Workers got raises, but those raises didn't match inflation. They fell behind while thinking they were getting ahead. But here's who won: the U.S. government. Federal debt in 1970 was $370 billion. By 1980, it was $907 billion. But in real terms, accounting for inflation, the burden decreased. They borrowed in $1970 and repaid in $1980 that were worth half as much. Corporations with assets thrived. Real estate values soared. Stock prices, after adjusting for inflation, stayed relatively flat, but companies that owned factories, land, and resources saw their asset values rise while their debt became cheaper to service. Banks made money on lending, collecting interest even as they paid savers below the inflation rate. The gap between what they paid depositors and what they charged borrowers was their profit, and that gap widened during inflation. The pattern repeated. Government escaped debt. Asset holders preserved wealth. Savers and workers got quietly destroyed, and when people complained about prices, the narrative blamed oil shocks, OPEC, unions, anything but the Federal Reserve's deliberate choice to inflate. Now the most recent example, the one that set up 2026, the quantitative easing era, 2008 to 2020, when central banks printed trillions and asset prices exploded while ordinary people treaded water. The 2008 financial crisis started with banks and bad mortgages. Lehman Brothers collapsed, the financial system faced panic, and the Federal Reserve's response was to print money on a scale never seen before. They called it quantitative easing. From 2008 to 2014, the Fed created over $3.5 trillion. They bought government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, flooding the financial system with new money. Where did that money go? Not to you. The Fed gave it to banks. Banks used it to rebuild balance sheets, to buy assets, to lend to corporations. Stock prices recovered and then soared. Real estate prices climbed, but wages barely moved. From 2008 to 2019, the stock market more than tripled. The S&P 500 went from 800 to over 3,000. Anyone who owned stocks got rich, but the bottom 50% of Americans own almost no stock. They didn't benefit. Real estate prices in major cities doubled. In San Francisco, median home prices went from $600,000 to over $1.3 million. New York, Seattle, Austin, the same pattern. If you owned property, you got wealthier. If you were renting and trying to save for a down payment, you got priced out. Meanwhile, savers earned nothing. From 2008 to 2015, savings accounts paid near 0% interest. Bonds paid 2 to 3%, while real inflation, the kind you feel at the grocery store, and rent bill ran higher. Every year your savings sat in the bank, they lost purchasing power. Here's the numbers. If you had $50,000 in savings in 2008 and left it in a typical savings account earning 0.5%, by 2019, you'd have about $53,000. But inflation officially ran at 20% over that period. So your $53,000 could buy what $44,000 bought in 2008. You saved, earned interest, and still lost $6,000 in purchasing power. But who won? The government. US national debt went from 10 trillion in 2008 to 23 trillion in 2019. But interest rates stayed near zero. Servicing that debt was cheap, and the real value of the old debt decreased as dollars were diluted. Banks won. They got bailed out, received cheap money from the Fed, and lent it out at higher rates. Bank profits recovered quickly. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all back to record profits by 2012. Asset holders won. Anyone who owned stocks, real estate, or businesses saw valuations skyrocket. The wealth gap exploded. The richest 1% captured more than 50% of all wealth gains from 2009 to 2019. The pattern, again, crisis hits, government prints money, asset prices soar, savers lose, workers tread water, and the narrative says the economy is recovering. But recovering for who? So who are the modern players running this system? Not families from the 1800s, institutions, central banks, governments, mega asset managers, and the financial elite who benefit from cheap money and rising asset prices. Let's name them. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank. Unelected officials who control interest rates and the money supply. Jerome Powell, current chair, and his predecessors. Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke. They decide when to print, when to raise rates, when to cut. Their decisions shape whether your savings grow or erode, and their track record is clear. When faced with a choice between protecting savers or protecting banks and governments, they choose banks and governments every time. The U.S. Treasury. They issue debt, trillions in bonds that get sold to finance deficit. Spending. Janet Yellen, current Treasury Secretary, former Fed chair, she benefits from inflation because it makes old debt cheaper to repay. Every percentage point of inflation reduces the real burden of the $33 trillion national debt. That's why they'll tolerate inflation, even when they say they won't. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, the mega asset managers. BlackRock alone manages over $10 trillion in assets. When central banks print money and push asset prices up, these firms profit directly. Larry Fink, BlackRock's CEO, has been vocal about the need for continued monetary support. Because cheap money inflates the assets he manages, his fees are based on assets under management. Higher asset prices mean higher fees. Inflation that hurts you helps him. Major banks. JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs. They borrow from the Fed at low rates and lend at higher rates. The bigger the spread, the more they profit. Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan's CEO, benefits from every round of quantitative easing that lowers his borrowing costs while keeping lending rates elevated. Corporations with pricing power, companies like Apple, Amazon, major pharmaceutical and energy firms, when inflation rises, they raise prices. Their revenues increase with inflation, but their old debts, borrowed at fixed rates, become cheaper in real terms. They win twice. These aren't shadowy conspirators. They're public figures, CEOs, central bankers, treasury officials, and their incentives align perfectly. They benefit from policies that create inflation, hold rates low, and let asset prices rise. Your loss is their business model. Now let me show you exactly how they steal purchasing power through inflation, step by step, with numbers you can feel. Step 1, printing money dilutes what you have. Imagine the economy as a pie. There's a fixed amount of goods and services available. The pie represents everything being produced. Now, there's also money in circulation, dollars competing to buy slices of that pie. When the government prints new money, they don't make the pie bigger. They just create more dollars. So now there are more dollars chasing the same amount of stuff. Each dollar buys less. It's not complicated. It's math. In 2008, the U.S. money supply was about $8 trillion. By 2023, it was over $21 trillion. The economy grew, but not that much. The pie got maybe 30% bigger. The money supply increased 160%. That gap is inflation waiting to happen. Step 2, interest rates below inflation guarantee loss. Let's say you have $10,000 in a savings account. Your bank pays you 2% annual interest. After 1 year, you have $10,100. But inflation is running at 7%. Everything costs 7% more than it did last year, so your $10,200 can buy what $9,530 could buy last year. You earned $200 in interest, but you lost $460 in purchasing power. Net result, you're 260 out poorer. This isn't hypothetical. From 2021 to 2023, average savings accounts paid about 0.5% while inflation peaked above 9%. Every saver in America with money in the bank lost purchasing power, guaranteed by design. Step 3. Asset inflation prices you out. The new money doesn't sit in savings accounts, it flows into assets, stocks, real estate, commodities. When the Fed creates $3 trillion, banks and investors use it to buy assets. Demand for assets increases, prices rise. From 2020 to 2021, during COVID stimulus, the median home price in America rose from $320,000 to $405,000, a 26% increase in 1 year, but median household income rose only 3%. So if you were saving for a house, the down payment you needed went from $64,000 to $81,000. You saved $3,000 that year. The house got $17,000 more expensive. You're not falling behind because you're lazy. You're falling behind because asset prices inflate faster than your income grows, and that's the design. New money flows to assets first. By the time it reaches wages, the prices have already risen. Step 4, wages and contracts lag behind. Your salary doesn't automatically adjust for inflation. Maybe you get a raise every year, maybe 3%, but if inflation is 6%, you just took a 3% pay cut in real terms. Union contracts, pension payments, social security adjustments all lag behind real inflation. The official CPI calculation understates real price increases through substitution effects and hedonic adjustments. So when they say inflation is 4%, your grocery bill says 8%. And even when wages do rise to match inflation, you've already lost. The price increases happened first. You paid higher prices for months before your raise kicked in. You're always playing catch up. Here's what this means in practice. You had $10,000 in savings in 2020. It's been sitting in a bank earning 0.5% interest. It's 2025 now, and your balance is $10,153. But inflation over those 5 years totaled about 25%. Your $10,950 can buy what $8,200 bought in 2020. You lost nearly $2,000 in purchasing power while thinking you were saving. That's the theft. Invisible, silent, and guaranteed by policy. So why 2026? Why is this the year your money dies? Because 3 forces are converging and they all point toward one outcome. Governments will choose inflation over default. They'll sacrifice your savings to save the system. Force 1, unsustainable debt that has to be refinanced. The U.S. national debt is over $33 trillion. That debt was borrowed over decades at various interest rates. Much of it was borrowed from 2008 to 2020 when rates were near zero. Those bonds are maturing. They have to be refinanced, but rates aren't near zero anymore. The Fed raised rates to over 5% in 2023. If the government has to refinance trillions of dollars of debt at 5% instead of 1%, the interest payments explode. In 2024, interest on the national debt exceeded $1 trillion annually. That's more than defense spending, more than Medicare. Paying that much interest means cutting other spending or raising taxes. Neither is politically viable. So what's the alternative? Lower rates again. Let inflation run. Use cheaper dollars to service expensive debt. Force 2, political pressure to stimulate. 2026 is a midterm election year. Politicians facing voters don't campaign on austerity. They campaign on jobs, growth, and prosperity. That means pressure on the Fed to cut rates, pressure on Congress to spend more, stimulus programs, infrastructure bills, anything to juice the economy before the election. And when the Fed cuts rates while debt is high and spending increases, that's the recipe for inflation. They're choosing short-term political gain over long-term stability, and you pay the price. Force 3, the illusion that inflation is controlled. By late 2024 and early 2025, official inflation numbers will likely show decline. The Fed will claim victory. Inflation is back to 3%, maybe 4%. The crisis is over, but that's when they'll make the move. They'll cut rates before inflation is truly back to 2%. They'll claim they need to support growth to avoid recession. And when they cut rates while prices are still elevated, that's when the second wave hits. Inflation doesn't stay at 3%. It accelerates again. This is exactly what happened in the 1970s. The Fed lowered rates prematurely in 1975. Inflation came roaring back in 1977 and 1978. Worse than before, the same pattern is setting up for 2026. Add it all together, massive debt to refinance, political incentives to stimulate, premature rate cuts while inflation isn't fully tamed. The result is another surge in prices, another round of money printing, and another transfer of wealth from savers to borrowers, from workers to asset holders, from you to them. 2026 is when they make the choice, and the choice is already made. Your savings are the sacrifice. Now let me show you how they hide it, how the narrative is managed to keep you from seeing the truth. Lie number one, inflation is temporary. They said it in 2021. Transitory, they called it. Jerome Powell, Janet Yellen, every financial official repeated the line. Just supply chain disruptions, just COVID after effects. It'll pass. But it wasn't temporary. Inflation peaked at 9%, and even after declining, it stayed elevated. Prices didn't go back down, they just stopped rising as fast. Your grocery bill that doubled didn't get cut in half. It stayed doubled. That's not temporary. That's permanent loss of purchasing power. Lie number two, blame corporations. When people notice prices rising, the narrative shifted. It's corporate greed. Companies are raising prices to pad profits. Oil companies, grocery chains, landlords, they're all gouging you. But here's the reality. Corporations didn't suddenly get greedy in 2021. They've always maximized profit. What changed? The money supply. The Fed printed trillions. That new money flowed through the economy, increasing demand. Companies raised prices because they could, because there was more money chasing the same goods. Blaming corporations is a distraction. It keeps you angry at businesses instead of questioning why the money supply increased 40% in 2 years. Lie number three, we're protecting the economy. Every time the Fed prints money or keeps rates low, they justify it as protecting jobs, supporting growth, avoiding recession. They're helping you, they say. But who actually gets helped? Banks that get bailouts, corporations that borrow cheap money, asset holders whose stocks and real estate soar. You get inflation, you get a 0.5% savings rate while prices rise 7%. That's not protection. That's theft dressed up as policy. The truth is simple, but it's hidden under layers of jargon. Quantitative easing, accommodative monetary policy, forward guidance, these are fancy terms for printing money and hoping you don't notice the inflation. They chose to dilute your money so they wouldn't have to cut spending, raise taxes, or let banks fail. Your loss was the price of their stability, and they'll do it again in 2026 because it worked before. Let me show you what this means for real people, not economic theory. Real consequences for families trying to survive. The retiree on a fixed pension, she worked 40 years, saved diligently, retired in 2015 with a pension paying $2,500 a month. That covered her rent, food, utilities, and left money for grandkids. By 2026, that same $2,500 buys what $1,500 bought in 2015. Her rent went up. Her groceries cost double. Utilities increased. Healthcare is more expensive. But her pension? Still $2,500. She didn't become less responsible. The money became less valuable. And now she's choosing between medication and food. The young family trying to buy a house. He's an engineer. She's a teacher. Combined income of $120,000 a year. Good jobs. In 2015, that income could buy a house in their city for $300,000, affordable with a 20% down payment. By 2026, the median home price is $650,000. Their income rose to $145,000, a 20% increase over a decade. But home prices more than doubled. The down payment went from $60,000 to $130,000. They've been saving $15,000 a year. But home prices rise faster than they can save. They're on a treadmill running backward, not because they're failing, because asset inflation prices them out deliberately. The worker who got a raise, he works in retail management. In 2020, he made $55,000 a year. He got raises every year. 3% in 2021, 4% in 2022, 3% in 2023. By 2024, he's making $63,000. He got a 15% increase over 4 years, but inflation over those 4 years was 25%. His groceries that cost $400 a month in 2020 cost $500 in 2024. His rent went from $1,200 to $1,600. His car insurance doubled. He's making more money, but he can afford less. In real terms, he took a 10% pay cut, and he thinks he got raises. These aren't edge cases. This is the majority. Workers with stagnant real wages, retirees with fixed incomes eroded by inflation, young people priced out of asset ownership, and all of them told the economy is recovering, that things are getting better. The data says otherwise. Real median household income, adjusted for inflation, is lower today than it was in 1999. 25 years of work. Productivity increased, GDP grew, but the median household can buy less because inflation quietly transferred wealth upward while wages stayed flat. So who wins? Who profits while you fall behind? Winner number one, governments. They borrowed trillions. Now they repay with cheaper dollars. The US borrowed $5 trillion in 2021 at near zero interest rates. If inflation runs at 6% annually for 5 years, the real value of the debt decreases by 30%. They effectively got a $1.5 trillion discount, paid for by your lost purchasing power. Winner number two, large borrowers and corporations. Companies like Apple, Amazon, Tesla, they borrow hundreds of billions at low fixed rates. When inflation runs hot, their revenues increase with prices, but their debt payments stay fixed. A company that borrowed $10 billion at 3% interest in 2020 is paying $300 million a year in interest. But if the revenue doubles due to inflation, that $300 million becomes a smaller percentage of income. Inflation inflates away their debt while increasing their nominal profits. Winner number three, asset holders. Anyone who owns stocks, real estate, gold, or other hard assets wins. The Fed creates new money. That money flows into asset markets. Asset prices rise faster than consumer prices. From 2020 to 2024, the S&P 500 went from 3,300 to over 5,000. That's a 50% increase. But if you didn't own stocks, you didn't benefit. The bottom 50% of Americans own less than 1% of all stocks. The wealthiest 10% own 87%. So when stock prices soar due to money printing, 87% of the gains go to the richest 10%. Real estate follows the same pattern. Homeowners saw their property values increase 40 to 50% in many markets from 2020 to 2024. If you owned a home, you got wealthier on paper. If you were renting, you fell further behind. This is the designed outcome. Inflation transfers wealth from people who hold cash and earn wages to people who hold assets and debt. The rich get richer not because they're smarter, because the system is built to inflate assets while eroding savings. Winner number four, the financial elite, hedge fund managers, private equity firms, investment bankers. They use leverage, borrowed money to buy assets. When inflation rises and asset prices soar, their returns explode. A firm that borrowed $100 million to buy real estate sees that real estate double in value. They made $100 million on a leveraged bet. Meanwhile, you saved $10,000 and lost purchasing power. These aren't accidental winners. The rules were designed this way. Inflation is the mechanism. Your loss is their gain. And they'll keep playing the same game because it works. So here's the truth they won't tell you. Your money will not survive in 2026 if you treat cash and bank balances as safe. They're not safe. They're guaranteed losses when inflation runs above interest rates. The system is designed to transfer wealth from savers to borrowers, from workers to asset holders, from you to them. And 2026 is the next big step in that pattern. They'll lower rates prematurely. They'll print more money. They'll let inflation run hot. And they'll blame external forces while your purchasing power dies. This isn't financial advice. I'm not telling you what to do with your money, but I am telling you to understand how the game works, to question the narratives, to realize that when they say they're protecting the economy, they mean protecting banks and governments, not you. Ask yourself these questions. If your savings are earning 2% and inflation is 6%, are you saving or losing? If home prices rise 10% a year and your income rises 3%, will you ever catch up? If the government prints trillions and calls it stimulus, who gets stimulated, you or them? The pattern has repeated for a century. Debt crisis, money printing, inflation, wealth transfer, and it's happening again right now. They will not warn you. They'll say inflation is transitory. They'll say the economy is strong. They'll say your savings are insured and safe. But insured against what? Not inflation. The FDIC protects you from bank failure. It doesn't protect you from your dollars buying half as much. Your bank balance will show the same number in 2026, but that number will mean less, buy less, protect you from nothing, and the people who design this system will be richer than ever because your loss is their business model. If you're starting to see the pattern, if you finally understand that inflation isn't an accident but a choice, then you're waking up to how power actually works. They're not going to teach you this in school. They're going to teach you that central banks stabilize the economy, that government spending creates jobs, that inflation is an unfortunate side effect of growth. But the contracts are public. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet is published. The money supply data is available. The pattern has repeated for 100 years. Crisis, printing, inflation, wealth transfer, same result every time. They profit, we pay, and the system continues. 2026 is when they do it again. Your savings are the target, and they will not warn you, because warning you would mean admitting the truth. That inflation is not a bug in the system, it's the business model, and you're the product being harvested. The only question is whether you'll see it before it's too late.